The first key driver of demand for commodities is the population. As you know, the world's population has grown from around 3 billion people in the 1950s, 1960s to where we are today, over 7 billion people. By 2050, we expect that there'll be 9 billion people on the planet. And it's not until 2100, according to the UN demographers, that the world's population will plateau off at around 10 billion people. Now, many of you in this room will be familiar with forecasts from Thomas Malthus back in the 1700s, the Club of Rome in the 1970s, that also forecasted commodity pressures and commodity wars born out of commodity scarcity. And a lot of that was linked to population. So you might be asking yourselves, well, why is it this time that it's different? And it's different because demographers argue that we are living in a very specific and very unique time in the history of the world. It's really important for us to understand this because demographers argue that we have never seen the speed of the population growth that we're seeing today in history or in prehistory. And once the world's population plateaus out in 2100, we will never see an increase in the world's population at the rate it's growing today. So it's really important to understand that today we're living in a very unique time in the history of the world with regards to the increase in population. To illustrate a little bit more, just bear in mind that according to some statistics, India's population is growing by 1 million people a month. The world population is growing at approximately 60 to 70 million people a year. That means every year we're adding a new Germany to the population. The second key driver that is putting pressure on commodity prices is wealth. There are many forecasts that have been argued that by 2030, the world will see 3 billion new people into the middle class, the majority of them coming from the emerging markets. As I'm sure many of you in this room know, 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging markets. And we are already seeing, with accompanying this increase in wealth, people demanding better quality foodstuffs. So instead of just demanding vegetables and greens, moving towards more protein-based commodities, such as meat, which demand a lot of water, and also other inputs to things like mobile phones and televisions and cars, all of which are drawn resources. But it's not just that the population is getting bigger, and it's not just that the population is getting richer, it's also about urbanization. Today, approximately 3 billion people live in urban areas. By 2030, we expect there'll be 5 billion people living in urban areas. Just to give you a bit more flavor on this, there are 9 cities in the United States that have 1 million people or more. In Europe, there are 18 cities that have 1 million people or more. In China today, there are about 100 cities that have 1 million people or more. And the Chinese government has a very specific plan to increase that number by 2020 through a program of urbanization to about 220 cities, which will have 1 million people or more. To put this further in context, I mentioned to you I'm from Africa, I'm from Zambia. The population of my country is approximately 13 million people. Those people in this room who've been to China will know that that's not even a real city in China. Yet the Chinese government are also planning that by 2020, there will be at least 10 cities that will have 10 million people or more. The 3 key elements are symbiosis. China's been very, very friendly in her approach to acquiring natural resources, giving the host countries what they want in return for getting access to natural resources. A second key element of the Chinese approach is that China has become a monopsonist. A monopsonist is such a big buyer, an important buyer of a commodity or a resource, so that they become the price setter. And for copper and coal already around the markets, China is considered a monopsonist price setter. Finally, there's the element of China having a broader utility function, and therefore, to some people, actually overpaying for many of the natural resource assets that exist around the world. In my book, I argue that it's actually not overpaying. China actually values assets in a much broader utility function, and therefore doesn't really focus only on the sort of inherent value of an asset using discounted cash flows. The implications of that are that commodity prices will be higher. So whereas we might value this table at 100 million, the Chinese might value it at 500 million because of the political imperative at home that they have got to deliver those assets home in order to keep the economic growth going along.